Having spent my entire adult life working each point of the press, politics, public policy triangle, you won't be surprised to hear that I have a bias. And my bias is shaped by an academic by the name of Thomas C. Leonard, who made two overarching points. The first is, media in Western liberal democracies is a primary site of political discourse. And the second is, in fact, media gives us the vernacular or the shorthand for much of that conversation. If I just say GST, you know what I'm talking about. The second part of my bias is that media, in particular in more recent decades, television, matters. And it matters not so much because it tells us what to think, but more precisely because it tells us what to think about. That a lot of the power of media lies in the media's ability to set an agenda and to prime us to think about political leadership in the context of that agenda, and then finally affords us an opportunity to speak to that, through public opinion research, et cetera, which can create a kind of a bandwagon effect. Now, that agenda-setting property tends to be endorsed by us, the news consumer. And it tends to flow from frames, which are, in effect, constructs put around a story. But the important point for our discussion today is that those frames are contested spaces. There are multiple voices that are part of the process of setting that frame. And you are absent from that discussion and that contest at your peril. Traditional or legacy media privileges a gatekeeper function. And historically, that gatekeeper was a professional journalist, and historically, those professional journalists had a lot to do with that agenda-setting process. But it did so in a particular construct, because media is at once a business and a public service. And the academic research suggests that the challenge inherent in that is that when the commercial considerations clash with the public service considerations, the commercial considerations too often prevail. Now, journalists will tell you that they see news as sort of a first draft of history. Others see it more precisely as what is different from yesterday. So news can kind of give an advantage to novelty. And the challenge inherent in that is that movements in particular, whether it's the civil rights movement or others, often have difficulty attracting day-to-day media coverage because their cause can lack the novelty that the news of the day requires. But that was then, and this is now. The economic model that sustained the, quote, free press for 200 years, which is the assembly of large audiences for people with paid messages to convey, has collapsed. Digital technology demands transformative change. Journalism is being rethought on a global scale. Legacy media is still powerful, but as currently constituted, its fate sort of sealed. So I would encourage you to think of media today more as an ecosystem. And that gatekeeper function that I spoke about is less completely in the hands of journalists. Now, I want to make one sort of point riffing off that. There is a tendency whenever a new media technology is created to proclaim the demise of everything that went before it. I would encourage you not to do that. I would encourage you to think about it as more of a reordering. And even the point I'm making around the gatekeeper function, a lot of people have been arguing for some time that it was a hugely positive development, that there were going to be more gatekeepers, that it was going to be less in the hands of professionals, and it was going to be more democratic and more accessible. And then a funny thing happened on the way to the forum. Twitter announced in the last few days that they're actually going back to hiring human editors, that the algorithm system of determining what got placed where is now going to be supported by somebody who comes to a judgment. Two quick final points. First, you will be hard-pressed to find anybody that understands social media less well than I do. I am a creature of my time. But I would encourage you to think of it more as a new network and not a new channel. One of the challenges that people of previous generations invariably face when a new technology is developed is that we try to do the things we used to do on the old channel on the new one, right? For those of you that may be around my age, you know, somebody actually thought it was a good idea to put Ed Sullivan on television. Right? Think about that for a second, right? So this is more about a networked world rather than another channel world. It's more about an interactive world. It's more about an opportunity to share and more about an opportunity to extend the storytelling. Final thought. As Alex Himmelfarb indicated yesterday in the panel discussion, you know, one of the consequences of government downsizing over 30 years has been largely the vacation of the policy shops in governments in government departments at every level. There is a void. I encourage you to fill that void. Civil society is the logical candidate for that. And here's why. In old journalism, often the expertise was around the politics of public policy. We knew less about the substance of the issue and tended to go pretty quickly to the politics around the issue. Because after all, we were political journalists and we were expert in politics. New journalism will require subject matter expertise. New journalism will be made by knowns who know, and that's you.
Hi, I'm Laura Ellis. I'm working for Alice Canada. I'm just following on what Fox has said there. And the title of this session is Who Says Charities Can't Have Opinions? And our new federal government does agree that we should have opinions. So their platform reads that we will allow charities to do their work on behalf of Canadians free from political harassment. And will modernize the rules governing the charitable and not-for-profit sectors. This will include clarifying the rules governing political activity with an understanding that charities make an important contribution to public debate and public policy. A new legislative framework to strengthen the sector will emerge from this process. And then they go on about home mail delivery, but I won't get into that. So I think a lot of the problems that we've seen in the past few years will no longer continue. I also think that I'll use some of my 10% political activities allowance to ask you all to follow up with the government to make sure that that commitment stands. So for the past few decades, I've worked for conservation organizations, and I've seen that sector mature quite a bit. In the beginning, there was a lot of talk about problems and what people were doing wrong and how this was all going to lead to terrible and more increasingly terrible problems in the future. So as the sector has matured, though, we've seen a lot more focus on solutions. Bruce Laurie was here today talking about Eco-Fiscal Commission. We've seen the development of certification systems like FSC and Cornerstone, industry and NGO negotiations like Canadian Boreal Forest Agreement and Lands for Life in Ontario, and the organization that I work for, Alice Canada, which is looking at new financial mechanisms to finance conservation on private lands. The difficulty with, we have increasingly sophisticated campaigns, but communicating what that should look like is becoming also increasingly difficult. Which is why when I was at Ivy Foundation, I worked with Ellis Sylvester on a new approach to that. So at this point, I'm going to give her some of my time. She has told me that she'll buy me a glass of wine later. And I'll also try to keep, I'll nudge her if she goes on for too long.
You know me well. And so do some of the other people in this room, and know that this is a huge passion of mine. And I want to first thank Hillary, because this is a rare treat to talk about this. This doesn't happen very often. So thank you for choosing this theme and this group. and also for choosing Matthew this morning, Mendelsohn. And I'm going to call him, from my perspective, Saint Matthew. I mean, wow, his insights around the charitable sector and the media, which really knocked my socks off. And I call him Saint because it's really, really hard to shake my Jesuit Catholic roots. So I'm always looking for mystics in the room. So Matthew is the one. I'm going to tackle, first of all, the question why. And I wanted to start by highlighting a seminal research study by a Dutch researcher named Giels, who many might know of his work. It's fantastic. He examined the introduction of the car and how it created whole-scale societal transformation. And he provides key insights for modern-day change agents, how to address systemic issues such as climate change, poverty, homelessness, etc. He states that we have to be seamlessly working at 3 levels. And our sector is very, very good at working at the niche level. We're all up to new ideas, technologies, new business models. And we're really good also at the regime level, where we focus on policy to change regulatory frameworks, to scale the innovations. But I would argue that we're not so great at culture. And we don't have a lot of innovation in this space. We don't get together and talk about these kinds of public engagement opportunities. And Giels basically stated in his summary of a 20-year study that if we don't start focusing on culture, we're going to lose our ability to implement policy and to scale innovation. He basically said that the showstopper is culture. So this is better said in a quick by Tom Atlee, who said, change the story field of a culture and we change what is real, acceptable, and possible. And I was at the World Futures Forum last year in Hamburg, and it was literally one mayor around the world after another that got up to the mic and said, you know, we have to be discussing in the public much more clearly how to transition to a low-carbon economy. And they said we have the policies, they're sitting on our desks, ready to be enacted. We have the technological innovations to scale. What we don't have is public will. And they literally begged us, the citizen sector representatives, to come up with new innovations for public engagement. And they were clear that telling our stories to shift the narrative was critical. And of course, the platform to do that is the media, as Bill talks about. So the media tectonic plate shifting, and essentially it continues to send shock waves through the industry. And let's take a look at what those shock waves are resulting in. These shifts are opening up new spaces for our sector to tell stories. And I'm going to quickly walk through a few trends. There's probably 100, but I just picked a few that we can leverage to build public will. Oops, I think I might have moved ahead there. Yeah. So I had an opportunity to meet with Arianna Huffington. We had lunch one day. And I asked her, what's the biggest media shift that the charitable sector could leverage to accelerate change? And she said that media is moving from attention deficit disorder to obsessive compulsive disorder. And that really means that when you wake up in the morning and you open up your newspaper, a lot of readers are not particularly satisfied by seeing a random assortment of breaking news stories that they don't really have a lot of context for. Neiman Journalism Lab, which provides research on the changing landscape of media, also agrees with this. They basically are talking about readers are leaving legacy media by the truckload because readers want to take a deeper dive into the issues that they're passionate about. This is a really good news story for us. So armed with this advice and Neiman Lab research, I approached the Christian Science Monitor and convinced them to partner with a then organization that I was working with called Ashoka to host a 2-week dialogue on a topic that was both interesting to Ashoka as well as to the Monitor reader. And this dialogue, we brought thought leaders from across the Ashoka world, social innovators from probably 20 different countries. And we drove traffic across their media properties, businesses, world affairs, et cetera. And this is like a media that gets 14 million reads a week. This is the big leagues. And the pilot was so successful that the publisher, Jonathan Wells, sent a personal letter to 75,000 of his loyal, or the Monitor's loyal subscribers, and basically said, should the Monitor continue to host dialogues? And should they do it over a longer period of time, for instance, over the course of a year? And the resounding response was yes. And specifically, they said, from the charitable sector. So now the Monitor, it was just announced in Neiman Lab about 2 months ago, has integrated dialogue and taking action right across their platform. So that's a huge transformation that a charitable organization impacted major media. And this is a prototype that I'm hoping to bring to the Canadian media, and we're discussing with a couple of senior or national papers right now. We'll keep our fingers crossed. I then went to do something a little different with the New Yorker, and wanted to go off into the magazine rather than their online. And I basically said, if I brought you a sponsor, would you cover a 7-page spread on social innovation? And what we'll do is we'll focus on 7 Ashoka Fellows in New York. And they basically said this was the first time they'd ever done that. They had a major firewall, of course, between marketing and the editorial. But while I was pitching it to them, they invited the editor to come in, and he said, let's do it. And they got one of their largest sponsorships to support this, because it was a 4-magazine, 7-page sponsorship. And when I was at Ashoka, we said, we want to be able to have the first refusal of the sponsor, because we don't want to have a sponsor there that doesn't align with our message. And so they let us do that, and it was Harvard University that actually sponsored it, because they felt that their students would be coming from that kind of inspiration around social innovation. So another trend that follows in the wake of this razor-thin medium budgets is major cost savings in curating rather than creating content. And this is where we can really play a significant role. Many of the foundations in this room fund some of the highest quality research, engaged content. Your grantees have identified critical issues and the system change required to address these wicked problems, and have done an impeccable job at doing this. They really are solutions, creating the solutions to transition the systems. And what I feel is, what you're sitting on are really the up-and-coming solutions journalists. They're embedded across the organizations that you're supporting. And in fact, many journalists are losing their jobs and moving into the charitable sector, so you're really working with the top-level writers. And this is rich content that the media is looking for. And if it's delivered in a clear, planned, and sustained way, it can become the mainstay of media platforms. And before I left Ashoka, we were providing content to 35 different media, including Forbes, the New Yorker, the New York Times, Mashable, et cetera. They all wanted our content, to the point where the New Yorker, because we were so well planned, we would send their content 3 or 4 months based on their editorial calendar. They started calling me and saying, hey, we're thinking about doing an issue on underground architectural gathering places. Do you have some ideas? Do you have some thought leaders? Do you want to co-host this with us? So it's amazing what can happen when you start building those kind of long-term relationships. One of the groups that is really taking this and running is a group that the J.W. McConnell Foundation is supporting. It's a group that is focusing on telling the stories, that I'm helping them tell the stories around Canadian businesses leading sustainable growth. And this is ClimateSmart Colab and the Natural Step. And what we're doing is really trying to unseat this entrenched narrative of jobs versus the environment. And that certainly was a killer for a certain leader in the last election, Stéphane Dion, and would have been really a killer for any of the other leaders if they led with it. So this is really an entrenched narrative that we need to unseat in order to get the policies around climate and low carbon economy addressed. And so this group is going to start working with me about developing that. And we have some amazing small, medium-sized, and large corporate sustainability stories to tell. I mean, do you know, I mean, I just found this out like 2 months ago, that Canada is the largest exporter of green energy. I mean, I had no idea. And that gives us a lot of promise as we lead to Paris and from Paris. And so as readers leave conventional media in droves, this is where they're moving, into niche communities of interest. In these communities, you'll find what Al Admansky calls passionate amateurs. This is really the media revolution. This is where the vocal minority reside, and they're hungry for the content that foundation sector grantees can provide. And we're doing an experiment with a group, with Natural Step, who I work with, called the Alberta Energy Futures Lab. And what we did was we chose 40 stakeholders from across the energy system. And they certainly had to be up-and-coming rising stars, critical leaders, thought leaders. But we also required them to be bellwethers, people who had an influential, large constituency that they could reach out and engage the public. And so what we're doing next week is launching an experiment, which is we have interviewed these fellows and we'll be interviewing them 3 times over the course of 5 years, 3 times every year over the course of 5 years, and really tracking through their expression the transformational leadership that they're going to be leading. And they will be sharing this with their constituencies. And this is about to be launched, and we're looking at literally over 100,000 people who will be directly impacted by these fellows. So more to come on that. So I'll kind of wrap it up by saying that it's time to be big enough to be noticed consistently and coherently across channels to shift narratives. And the coherency is really important. I think we're all getting very, very good individually of being great at campaign work. But what's the shadow side of this is we're really confusing the public. We have such niche areas of focus. Even with the green economy, there's so many individual messages. And so we have to start looking at how do we build a coherent narrative that is not organizationally and brand specific, but also very clearly audience specific. And the last group that I'll profile is the green, the economy cohort. This is a group that essentially is going to be working with my organization, Social Currents, which is once like the Eco-Fiscal Commission, once they launch a report, which really has 1 day of real circulation, they will donate all of that content into the commons. And so we're looking at 16 e-NGOs, university research, et cetera, is doing the same. Once they donate it into the commons, then my team of writers can repurpose it and literally translate that message to key audiences, the vocal minority around Canada. So for instance, paddleboarders in Canada, the biggest sports industry growth in the world, they are actually inherently committed to sustainability. And so we're able to repurpose these kinds of messages to be able to have a conversation at the level and the interest that these niche communities can. And I know, I've bored more than Lars, right? Okay, I'll wrap it up. So just a call to action to this incredible group in this room that we need new meta-narratives, and we have the assets in the room. You're supporting and stewarding thousands of change agents, many of whom are solution journalists. You're also funding the brightest researchers in public deliberations, whose insights we haven't yet aggregated to identify even more powerful public engagement opportunities. And we have passionate amateurs in niche platforms in the millions that want to engage with our content. So I'm looking forward to continuing this discussion with you, and we'll let you know how these little experiments are doing over the course of next year. Thanks very much.
Okay. Well, first I have to disclose that I am not an expert in the sense that it would create fellowships, it would support journalists reporting on specific issues of public importance, and then foundations, hopefully multiple foundations, would come forward and help support that. And one of the first groups that we talked to was Tides Canada, and they felt at the time that we're heading up to the Paris Climate Summit, and we need more reporting of climate issues. There's an election coming up, climate summit coming up. It'd just be nice if we could have somebody like covering this stuff on a day-to-day basis, following it, and could we work together? They asked us, and Rob was interested. We thought it could be done through the foundation, but the foundation was in its early stages. We couldn't really meet their requirements at the time. I had already made a decision to step down from Corporate Knights to explore other things. Just hit the 4-year mark, and I pulled the parachute and decided to try something new. And I said to Tides, I said, look, I'm going to be available September. Why don't I contact John Hondrick and say, Tides wants to pay for me to be a beat reporter at the Toronto Star. Are you into that? And he was all over it, because the previous fall, he had just started this whole campaign of what he calls philanthrojournalism, and it started with Atkinson Foundation funding a precarious workplace beat. And that was very successful. He wants to expand that. So when I told him that I wanted to create a beat titled Climate and Economy, specifically with the economy angle, because my goal is to try to make the connection between the environment and the economy, he said, let's do it. So I started almost 2 months ago, and I'm only on a 4-month project, and it expires a few weeks after Paris. And it's been quite successful. It's been a learning experience because it's new, and I've made a lot of observations on how I would restructure it going forward. But I think that it really fills a niche where right now a lot of the stuff that you're hearing about climate news is doom and gloom, right? Basically, you open up the paper, you read the latest study, we're screwed, right? Sea level rise, melting glaciers, biodiversity is getting killed, and I've always been a solutions-based journalist, so it was a good fit, because what I wanted to do is write about what are the companies out there that are tackling this issue, that are giving us hope, what are the different models that we can embrace, how we can learn from different jurisdictions, and I also felt it was important to keep it in the business section, to keep instead of it being the environmental reporter, and people, when they think about an environmental reporter, it's like they're reporting about the latest oil spill in a river, and it's all this bad news stuff. I wanted the vast majority of what I was writing to be positive. So that's where we stand, and I'm hoping that I can continue it through 2016, and because the climate issue is not going away after Paris. Now, in being there for a couple of months, I have thought about what would be better ways to do it and what the different models are, and I think that it could be in the form of a series, a regular thing that appears, it's guaranteed in the paper at a specific time, and it has a certain amount of profile. It could be just very, very targeted coverage of issues. The fact that this particular structure is me in a beat is interesting, because Tides Canada didn't want to have anything to do with what I'm writing about, nor would the Toronto Star want that, nor would I want that. But they just wanted to establish the parameters going into the fact that we know that climate and economy issues are going to be covered, and we're satisfied with that, and we feel that it's a better bang for the buck than spending what would probably work out to the same, maybe a little bit less money, but probably the same, on a single research report that gets nowhere. So that's the experience that I can share. A couple of other observations. I think transparency is very important in establishing this, and every time I write a story, we have actually not a little thing at the bottom, we have a long thing at the bottom explaining the relationship. And I think as long as readers know that you're being upfront with them, and they know where this money is coming from and where this reporting is coming from, they're cool with that. What they don't want is to feel that they're having the wool pulled over their eyes. And I also think that going forward, this approach would benefit more from a kind of a multi-foundation approach. Instead of having one foundation support it, it really deals with that public perception that might emerge about coverage being bought. I think it's a fair argument to say that a bunch of foundations coming together to help sustain beat reporting on a particular issue that's underreported is a fair argument to make, and I'm willing to defend it at every step. Thanks very much.
So we have a few more minutes for, I hope, some conversation, and there'll be a bit of conversation with the panel itself, and then I hope some of you, if you have an opportunity and a burning question, will be willing to get to a microphone. I think we do have roving mics. Yes, Sarah? Do we have a roving mic? Anyway, we will have a microphone available so that somebody can ask a question if they like. But I'm going to start off a little bit. So a number of you talked about, and we talked about this, of course, before when we were setting up this panel. We discussed the context in which media coverage of philanthropy and public policy today, how that context is changing. And all of you have referred to some of those aspects. If I could summarize, I think what we had discussed was things like the politicization of public debate, and that was a concern. Actually, at the time that we started talking about this panel, we still had the Harper government, and as we all recall, the Harper government, because it called itself the Harper government, made it difficult for people, charities and philanthropy in particular, to make public comments that might be critical of the government without them becoming partisan comments. Because if you're criticizing the Harper government, you may also, by implication, be criticizing the political party which Harper led and which was totally identified with the government. So in other words, you can't criticize the government because then you're doing something partisan. That may change. That may not change. This may be a long-term trend in the sort of the public debate and the ways in which we can interact with the government. And I'd be interested in your thoughts, as people watching the discussion today, the sort of public debate today, what you think about that. But before I ask you to comment on that, let me also say a couple of other things that we had discussed. There is an issue. We talked about narrative. We've talked about needing coherence in our narrative. We've talked about needing to frame the story and to create story fields. And I strongly agree with all of that. I think that that's something that philanthropy itself needs to do much more effectively over the next few years. But we're dealing with, not just in the foundation sector, but in the charitable sector as a whole, we're dealing with a lot of risk aversion. We're dealing with the fact that charities and foundations generally don't see themselves as being advocates, as being storytellers, as being actors in this sort of public conversation, for fear of that somehow not being charitable. So that's been a large part of the discussion that we've had today, actually, in the various presentations that we've had. And that is something that I think we have to deal with. I'm looking particularly at Ellis here, who is saying, let's see how we can create this new frame. But I'm also looking at Bill. How do we get people in philanthropy energized and willing to step up, not simply to build awareness on a particular issue? And if you all heard Tanya Beer a few minutes ago, you will have heard her make the distinction between awareness, will, and action in terms of the advocacy role. So you can build awareness by putting out a research report. You can build will. You can go a step further and build some will by building a story about the results of that research report. And you can go as far as action and really do advocate a particular public policy change. So there are different ways in which foundations and charities can engage, but they don't, generally speaking. So I wonder if you could comment a bit more about the context that we're working in today. And although some of that I acknowledge will have changed on October 19th, maybe not entirely. Bill, do you want to start?
Sure. I think part of the answer may lie in this transition in new media terms. I talked before about the fact that, in the past, we focused more on the politics of public policy rather than the substance of the public policy. And so by definition, on engagement, the terms and conditions of that engagement were restricted by that frame. By definition, you were talking about the politics of an idea as opposed to the idea itself. Now, for those of us with the attention span of a flea, that attention deficiency disorder journalism had some appeal. And it was capsulized, you'll remember the traditional kind of 5 W's of journalism, right? Who, what, where, why, when. Well, the thinking today is that those 5 W's are going to give way to 5 I's and an O. And the I's are informed, intelligent, interesting, insightful, interpretive, original. What does that mean? It's going to move away from the politics of it to the substance of the idea. And I couldn't agree more about the need for a master narrative supported by a story arc. We should be inspired by the successes of people in the world of sports, right? If you think about the sports pages, we still read them. We all know the score of the game. We all watch the Jays in 30 minutes at 11 o'clock. We watch the highlight reels on TSN. And we still get our Toronto Star and read the sports story. Why? Because they've succeeded at a master narrative. So think about hockey, right? The master narrative is the Stanley Cup. A trade in the dead of July involving a non-roster player gets significant media coverage in the context of what that's going to mean for the Leafs Cup chances. Now, we in Toronto know the answer. But my point is, it's driven by a master narrative. And it's supported by story arcs through the piece that support that national narrative. So you have to come to it. And you have to come to it in a way that allows you to engage in the substance of the idea.
Please.
That's great, Bill. Perfect. So Bill talks about the front end, the front facing with the public. We also have to get really good at the backbone.
Just make sure that you're...
Yeah,
your
the
microphone's
backbone, which is, if we're going to engage with the media, we need to engage with them in essentially their system. And we always, I always say, these op-eds get written, everyone signs off on it, and then it's a spray and pray, it just goes out. And everybody's trying to get at what the media does is organize 85 to 90% of what goes in. They know months in advance, and they give themselves about 15% reactive. And we're always trying to get into that 15%. We could be focusing on the 85. And that's what we did at Ashoka, was essentially we looked at the editorial calendar across the year, 5 years in advance. We knew when the G20 was coming, when Canada was hosting the G20. I always say the G20 is the story that's never told, because every media has to cover it, but everything's embargoed. Literally, there's no news that comes out until the G20. So you've got weeks leading up there with this kind of currency, this real estate on every media. Organize, that's what social currency is doing, is organizing ourselves in such a way that we can tell our stories in how the media actually works. And that's why they come back to you and start planning their next magazine that's 6 or 7 months down the road, because they know that you can work with them that way. So that's the backbone, which requires all kinds of systems to be able to support it. But I think something that I learned from my time finding the best nascent innovations around the world is social innovation. To me, is like the disruptor. Because if you look at Gales, where you're working at, you need to be working at the niche level, which is of course the innovation, and you need to be working at the policy. What we're missing is culture, but actually social innovation has culture generally as its core. If you look at really solid good social innovation, it literally is transforming cultural norms. So even just telling the stories of social innovation is quite a disruptive opportunity, where we can really be hitting all of those 3 levels. And so the question of you shouldn't be hitting policy, because it's going to be seen as politicized. Well, you tell a story about an innovator. I'm thinking about one in outside of Kampala, where it was women who were literally disenfranchised from their families because they contracted AIDS. And what a particular social innovator went in there to do was deal with the issue of infant and maternal health issues. And what they had was they had a business, and they had the women who had contracted AIDS sell sterilized equipment to the doulas in the community. What a disruptive cultural change. You know, there you've got a business model that's really at the niche level, but ultimately what you're dealing with is changing the whole framing of these women who are now bringing money into their community and into their homes, but are also associated with being unclean, selling sterilized equipment. And quickly you start seeing that transformation. I think there's some really, really interesting stories in the Canadian social innovation space that really could be taking up a lot of real estate in our media.
Tyler, I wanted to pick up on some of what you were saying about ways of bringing philanthropy into the sort of the structuring of the sort of capacity to tell the story, essentially. You talked about ProPublica. You know, as we know, there are American foundations that have, such as the Knight Foundation and Pew, that have invested heavily in building an alternative media, in a sense, a media based on expert journalism, content journalism, but the journalism that specifically covers issues that are not being covered by either traditional media or by the new social media channels. I don't think we have that in Canada. I don't think that's happening in Canada yet. And I don't know if you want to speculate about how that might develop. You've talked a little bit about the Atkinson Foundation and about Tides, but do you have some thoughts around, you know, what should we have a Canadian ProPublica?
Well, the key thing about those U.S. excuse me, initiatives, it's getting over a cold, is that they do partnerships with traditional mainstream media. And I think that's key, because part of the problem in this age of the internet is that there's a lot of places that you can put this content, but it's not necessarily going to be read by as many people or the right people. Years of covering this area, and the environmental area, I'm getting tired of preaching to the converted, right? So you got to try to figure out ways of bringing in new people that aren't exposed to this. Reason why I like the idea of going back to the start, because I was there 10 years earlier, is that it's a large mainstream news organization that can really, where my stories are going to be read, even if it's only the first graph or just the headline, by people who don't pick up Corporate Knights magazine, right? Corporate Knights have been distributed in the Globe and Mail for 12 years, and the majority of people I bump into go, no, I've never heard of that.
How many in the room have heard of Corporate Knights? Put your hand up. Okay.
So this is an example of preaching to the converted. To your question about can we have a ProPublica here, I think absolutely we can, and I don't know why we don't. Again, why are our foundations and philanthropic groups risk averse? I don't know if they're risk averse as much as just not really kind of looking into what's possible or testing what's possible. I'm sure there's a lot of people who will leave this room today going, wow, I never knew I could approach a newspaper and maybe put some money in and create a beat for an issue that we care about. And at the same time, it's not going to work with every news organization, right? I don't think you could go to the National Post and convince them to give up being paid by the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers and instead hire a reporter like me to cover climate change. It ain't going to work. So you have to be very selective with the organization that you're choosing. But the thing that Rob Cribb is trying to create, I think, is an example of a potential ProPublica, where it's targeted at investigative journalism, which could be part of 4-month projects or 1-year projects. It doesn't have to, it could be in the form of a fellowship. It doesn't have to be an investigative project. It could be them having a certain slice of the program that creates beat reporters for various issues and then works with various media that are interested in hosting them. There's all sorts of models that could be adopted, and we can get creative with it. The key is just having the structure set up so that there's arm's length between the money flowing in and the money flowing to that reporting. And I think a foundation like that, or partnering with a news organization like the Star, where you've got editors and publishers and that, at least there's a public perception that there's there's kind of this mediation in between. I think that's the way forward. I don't like the model of Greenpeace hiring a bunch of top-notch journalists and then putting out a bunch of bylines from them under the term Greenpeace, because no one will touch it, except for a lot of those niche websites out there that are covering environmental issues.
Laura, I don't want to leave you out if you've, jump in at any point.
No, I thought, are we taking questions from the floor?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Does anybody have Adam has a question, and there is a mic back there, Adam, coming to you.
It's actually just more a comment than a question. Actually, entirely serendipitously, I had the case in my bag today called News to You, v. Minister of National Revenue, that considered the charitableness of some of this. And this is what the judge, lawyers don't normally bring good news. He says, I agree that the production and dissemination of in-depth news and public affairs programs may improve the sum of communicable knowledge, but such activities are not sufficiently structured for education. They provide nothing more than an opportunity for people to educate themselves. And then on the issue of whether it fall under the fourth head of charity, this is a direct quote, I agree that the production and dissemination of in-depth news and public affairs may improve awareness of current affairs, but I do not consider these purposes to be in the nature of the special benefit, by which the judge meant public benefit, required of a charitable organization, and then went on to summarily conclude that all of the above was non-charitable at law. So it's not a question, it's a comment, and I throw it out there as food for thought, but I thought I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the decision was 2011 from the Federal Court of Appeal, and it seems directly on point with the discussion. So my contribution and my apologies simultaneously.
Yeah.
Okay, we're depressed. Thanks,
Why
Adam.
Yeah, just going back to the Liberal platform, there's an opportunity to change that in the next few years. So I would encourage people to follow up on that.
It's certainly been a topic of discussion today, yes.